Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's start with our next topic here, that is post-war international economic order. Now students, you must be thinking that again we are talking about post-war international economic order. So this time we are going to talk about Second World War. Before this, you have learnt about the post-war economy that was related to the First World War. And this is the scenario that took place or that happened after the Second World War. So here what are we going to understand? We are going to talk about the recovery that took place in the international economic order. How the order was set after the Second World War. What were the changes that took place? What were the new rules that were introduced or the institutions that came up after the Second World War? We are going to understand this here in this topic. Now, before the students, you have learnt about the Great Depression. Am I correct or not? Yes. And you also saw how India was impacted in this Great Depression that started somewhere in 1929, right? So here let's focus on what happened in the Second World War and also what were the changes that took place worldwide after the Second World War. So the Second World War, if I ask you the timeline, do you remember that? Yes, you should remember that because we have talked about it numerous times now. It was from 1939 to 1945. Correct? So the Second World War, it ended in the year 1945. So Second World War again was fought between the two powerful groups here. The first one is the Axis powers and the second one is the Allied powers. Right? So Germany fighting on the one side, Britain along with France, Italy fighting on the other side. So here we see that these two factions again fought from this year, that is 1939. But again, we will see that there was the same impact after the Second World War. This time, the lives of common people were lost more in the Second World War, apart from the armed people, the armed forces. So, 60 million people, they were killed in the Second World War. So, this was a huge number of people who lost their lives. Again, many parts of Europe and Asia were devastated. Definitely, now the war took place on a large scale. So, all these regions of Europe and Asia that were involved in the war were devastated at that time. It also caused economic loss and social unrest. Now, students, you have understood it by now that whenever we are talking about a war that happened on a large scale, definitely it has some bad repercussions. Be it in the economic terms, on the social terms, political, or when we are talking about the human loss. So here as well, in Second World War, we see that many people, they lost their lives. There was economic setback, social unrest, political unrest, and now people were not understanding how to stabilize that and how to recover from that. And we see that during this period, the post-war reconstruction period that we are talking about after 1945, it was marked by two crucial influences. Now, there were two main changes in the political scenario that happened after the Second World War. The first one is emergence of the United States as dominant power. Till now, we were talking about the European powers again and again, right? But here we are going to talk about the rise of United States as a dominant power. Quite important point here, students, because in today's day as well, you see that the United States is one of the supreme powers all over the world, right? So it maintained its dominance from here. The second one is dominance of Soviet Union. Yes, students. Soviet Union here is present-day Russia region. At that time, it was known as the Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union. Okay? So, Soviet Union was not that popular at that time, right? It was not that dominant all over the world in the European scenario when we are talking about. But after the Second World War, they defeated Nazi Germany, right? And they had to face a lot of obstacles. But definitely, they were now on the top, as in competing with the United States. So these were the two crucial influences that now shaped or marked the post-war reconstruction. Now, again, one more thing that I would like to point out here is the ideas of economists. According to them, what were the new changes that should take place after the Second World War? Now, the economists definitely they understood one thing here. What was that? Let us try to understand it. So, the economists they said that in any industrial world, now here there are some terms that you will be aware of here. So basically, what are these economists trying to say? They are saying that in any industrial world, mass production. So I told you that you will know the term here. You have already read about mass production. So the mass production is incomplete without mass consumption. What do we understand by this, students? Mass production, mass consumption, how are they even related? They are related like this, that when we are producing large quantities of a similar product, definitely there has to be these people who are going to consume, right, in large quantities as well. Then only all these industries can gain profit, right? So this is what you have to understand through this line here, that mass production is incomplete without mass consumption. But when we are talking about mass consumption, how is this going to happen? It is only going to happen if there is a stable economy, correct? Only if people have enough money to buy these products that are being made. Only after that, they are going to ensure that all these mass-produced goods are being consumed. Correct or not? Definitely. So, for this stable economy, what do we need? For this stable economy, we need employment. Stable employment. Right? So, these economists, they were trying to emphasize on two things here. Now, what are these two keywords here? The first word is stable economy. Like I told you, when we are talking about mass production and mass consumption, we need stable economy and we need full employment of all the people, right? Employment and stable economy were the two keywords for these economists. Therefore, the main aim of post-war international economic system was to preserve economic stability and full employment in industrial world. So this was the main aim, students, after the Second World War. Quite nice way to understand the whole concept here, right? Finally, what happened? Now, thinking about this as the main aim, all these almost around 44 allied nations, they decided to meet after the Second World War, and a framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference that was held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. So, this was Bretton Woods Conference. Why are we calling it Bretton Woods Conference? Because it was held at Bretton Woods, and this was formerly known as United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Okay? So these two terms are really important for you. In 1944, they all met here and finally they agreed on two things. For full employment and economic stability. So emphasizing on this, they agreed to work upon these two situations here and how to recover that. Finally, they established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the world's major industrial states. Now, they started by establishing the rules for commercial and financial relations. Among whom? Among these major industrial states all over the world, so that they could ensure economic stability. Because we have already seen that after any war that has taken place on such a large scale, there is going to be an economic instability all over the world. So how to recover that? How to take actions just after that? So this was the way that they started. It was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent nations. So all the independent nations, they came together and they decided to ensure economic stability among them. Regulate the international monetary system. They established the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Short form is IBRD, and International Monetary Fund, that is IMF. So here are 2 points that you have to keep in mind. Now, keeping in mind the whole aim and the whole idea, there were two institutions that were also known as Bretton Woods institutions or Bretton Woods twins. So finally, two institutions were formed. What were these two institutions, students? One was IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and in today's day, we commonly call it as the World Bank, right? So it was to ensure speedy recovery of economy all over the world. So basically, World Bank was to give monetary help to all these nations and ensure the speedy recovery of economy. When we are talking about International Monetary Fund, so it was to stabilize the exchange rates in different nations and also to help them and also to stabilize the economy there, right? So these were the two institutions that became operational in 1947 and they are working in today's day as well, right? So imagine that at that period of time, these people, they organized these two institutions and today we know their name as well, right? After the Second World War. So the chief features of the Bretton Woods was to adopt a monetary policy that maintained the exchange rate of its currency within a fixed value. Now here are some new terms for you students that you need to understand and quite important terms. First one is exchange rate. What do we understand by this exchange rates? So the exchange rates, it links national currencies for purposes of international trade. So basically, this is a rate or at which any nation or any country, they set a value of their currency, the exchange value of their currency to the currency of any other nation. Now, giving in simple terms, let's say you must have heard in news about how many US dollars equals to Indian rupee. What is the value of US dollar in Indian rupee? So this is the exchange. Like when we are talking about the United States, dollar is the currency. When we are talking about our country, rupee is the currency. So what is the exchange rate when we are talking in terms of international trade? So what is the value of 1 rupee in terms of US dollar? Now if we are talking about today, so the value is again fluctuating. Let's say it is rupees 27. 1 US dollar, the value of that is rupees 71. 71, right? So you have to keep in mind all these points here. The exchange rate is quite important. Now the exchange rates are of two types. The first one is the fixed exchange rate and the second one is the floating exchange rate. Now when we are talking about the Bretton Woods institutions, they worked on this fixed exchange rate, right? So when exchange rates are fixed and governments intervene to prevent movements in them. So basically when we are talking about fixed exchange rate, it means that the currency's value has been fixed. Now one country has fixed the currency value with the other country's currency, right? The government has fixed that. So this is known as the fixed exchange rate at which the international business is going to take place. When we are talking about the floating exchange rates, as the term suggests, floating, it means that the value is going to fluctuate. The value is not constant, it is varying, right? But on what it is dependent. So the rates fluctuate depending on the demand and supply of currencies in foreign exchange markets without the interference of government. So in floating exchange rate, we do not need the interference of government and the exchange or the value takes place based on the demand and supply of these currencies. So you have to keep this point in mind here. Now talking about the International Monetary Fund, students, it was established on December 27, 1945, main instrument of public international management and keeper of rules. It advised the countries on policies affecting the monetary system, like we have discussed right now. Its approval was necessary for any change in exchange rates in excess of 10%. So whenever there was the exchange rate was taking place beyond 10%, so the approval of IMF was necessary. This is the logo of International Monetary Fund. The second one is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, known as World Bank, right? So it was set up to promote the growth of world trade and to finance the post-war reconstruction of Europe. So basically, they had to promote the growth of world trade, they had to see economic stability. This is the building of World Bank in today's day. Now there are some other information that you must know here. Under Bretton Woods system, there was the growth of trade and income for Japan and other Western nationalist nations. So here what are we seeing? That under this Bretton Woods system, when we are talking about IBRD and IMF, these were the two institutions. So there was this growth of trade and income for Japan and other Western nationalist nations. Unemployment rates, they fell below 5% in these countries. Now what are we seeing? We are seeing some positive changes here. That unemployment rate was now declining. Right? Also, developing nations did not benefit as they were dominated and exploited by the colonial powers. Now at the same time, what are we seeing? These Western dominated regions, they were getting profit from these Bretton Woods institutions. But when we are talking about the developing nations, were they being satisfied by these institutions? No, students. Because they were being dominated by these Western nations, the colonial power, right? The decision making in World Bank and IMF was controlled by the Western countries, right? Developing countries formed themselves into a group of 77, which is known as G77 popularly. Now here we see that originally group of 77 countries, they came together to form this association which was known as G77. And what was their main demand? The main demand was to get a new international economic order. Now, when we are talking about G77 students, it means that we are talking about the developing countries. And why these developing countries were trying to form an association? Because we saw that these developing countries, they were not getting any benefit from the Bretton Woods institution. because they were being dominated by the colonial powers, and after they became free, this is an irony that they were being held by the institutions that were owned by the Western countries. So overall, definitely they were not getting much help as these Western nations. So therefore, they demanded a new international economic order that was also known as NIEO. This system would give them real control over their natural resources, fairer prices for raw materials, better access for their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. So what were their main demands here? New international economic order in order to give them real control over their natural resources. So the control should be in the hands of these people in the developing countries. Apart from that, fairer prices of raw materials and better access for their manufactured goods, right? Now this was all about the Bretton Woods institutions here, students. Coming to our exercise section, in multiple choice questions, there is a question that says the decision making in the IMF and World Bank is controlled by. Options are all the member nations of these two banks, Western industrial powers, and the US's right to veto over key IMF and World Bank decisions, the Asian African bloc, and a majority vote by all Indians. These are the four options. Now, what according to you is the correct answer here? Let us see the first option. All the member nations of these two banks. Have we read this sentence here while we were talking about IMF and World Bank? No, students. We see that the Western nations were controlling. We read that? Correct? And one point that you must remember was that US had veto power. The power to decline or to postpone any decision. That was the US's power in any IMF and World Bank key decisions. So definitely the answer here will be B. The next question is, the IMF was established on A. December 27, 1945, December 30, 1945, December 15, 1947, December 26, 1947. What is the correct answer? Yes, we read that December 27, 1945. This is the correct answer for the establishment of International Monetary Fund. The next question in very short answer question. Name the Bretton Woods institutions. What are the Bretton Woods institutions known as? First one would be IBRD. Second word would be IMF. Now can you tell me the full form? International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also known as World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. So you have to write this in your answer. What did G77 demand? What is the correct answer here? First of all, write about G77. Developing countries that formed a loose association or loose group association of 77 countries originally. And what was the main demand? New international economic order. That was the main demand of G77 countries here, right? So that they can have fairer prices of raw materials and also they can have better access to the manufactured goods in developed countries' markets and so on, right? They should have real control over the natural resources. In short answer question, we have a question that says, what is the popular name of international bank set up for reconstruction and development? What are you going to write here? The name is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is popularly known as World Bank, that started in the year functioning in the year 1947. And what was the main idea here? to speed up the economic recovery. So this is how you are going to answer this question here. Mention the two crucial influences that marked post-war reconstruction. Now what is the answer here, students? The first will be dominance of United States in social, economic, political arena. United States. The second will be dominance of Soviet Union after defeating Nazi Germany in the Second World War. So this is that you have to answer here. Give 2 or 3 lines, that would be suffice here. In long answer question, you have to talk about the chief features of Bretton Woods system. So firstly, talk about how in 1944, 44 allied nations, they came together at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA, and then they decided to work on this reconstruction program. Right? Then talk about the 2 institutions that were formed and what was the main aim here. So it was the monetary recovery international terms, and the 2 institutions IBRD and World Bank that were formed for speedy recovery or economic recovery that after the Second World War, right? So you have to mention these points here. Talk about IBRD, the World Bank, what was the main function. Then talk about IMF, talk about that, right? So these are some of the points that you will mention here.